I am really excited to talk to you guys today about a topic that's quite important, and we did hear a couple of presentations before talking about needs and behaviors and attitudes and mental models. So I really hope that's a method I'm going to introduce that's a very simplified version from the original method. I really hope that's going to be valuable to you. Before we really jump into the topic and I kind of show you the plan for the next half an hour, a very quick intro so you know who is standing in front of you. I do consider myself truly user-centered because, as you already might know, my alias is Martina Mitz. Good luck pronouncing or spelling my real name. I did start last century already, so thank you, Theo, for the young lady. I appreciate that. I did start already last century as a self-taught web designer, and then in the beginning of this century, I already had first paid clients, which helped me very much to not only finance my living in Germany, but also my study in psychology. That one I finalized in 2007, specializing as clinical psychologist. And then it wasn't even a year that I worked as such, and I completely burned out. So I needed to step back and think again, what was my passion, what I really wanted to do actually. That led me back to design, but 10 years later, design was called a bit differently. So I started in 2009 doing pretty much everything that was out there with UX design, so all the different disciplines, starting with concept, information architecture, interaction architecture, all of that. Before then, I was working that for a few years, and then in 2014, 5 years later, after getting to know all these different disciplines, even visual design, I kind of started working more and more on that strategical level, giving the bigger picture for companies and then prioritizing based on that, facilitating innovation workshops, and so on and so forth. And then it was, I have to say, in 2018 that I finally married my passion and my profession and started calling myself UX psychologist, inspired by a couple of colleagues from the UK, I have to say here. Before I go on to the topic, guys, and take the whole presentation talking about me is not the idea here. I just wanted to warn you, as Theo mentioned, I'm not only in Bulgaria, but I'm also Bulgarian. I'm Eastern European. So if I'm too loud, if I'm too blunt, or maybe sometimes not too politically correct, please consider that it isn't in our nature to be able to keep calm. So having said that, going back to the topic, I wanted to give you a bit of an idea how we are going to approach it. It's I'm sorry if you expected me to give you a method and then a couple of examples and run with it. It's rather we're going to do it the scientific way. So first of all, I want us all, even though we probably know what I'm going to talk about, establish a common fundament, understanding the psychological background, where this theory is, even how psychologists perceive humans, then looking at how do psychologists view behaviors, before we then have a look at the actual behavior theory. That's where the understanding part starts to happen, from which theory the actual method that I wanted to introduce to you in a very simplified way, in a very simplified version. And then last but not least, because one thing is the understanding, I will try to make that knowledge, that understanding a bit more tangible for you, giving a couple of examples. But I would also be more than happy if you guys throw in an example and let me analyze it in the question and answers, or if you come up with your questions, of course, I'll be more than happy to answer them. As I said, it all starts with psychology. And the sign that you see on that psychological slide, on that psychology slide, is the Greek letter Xi, or I assume Psi in English pronunciation. And that's the sign for psychology, as probably some of you know. And when I say psychology, guys, I'm not talking about psychiatry, psychoanalysis, maybe a little bit, I mentioned here and there, psychotherapy. And I know this is all mind-blowing, even for psychologists, sometimes it gets a bit confusing. So first, what I want to try is to kind of shed some light on this whole psych terms that I throw in the mix, and that are usually thrown when we have common conversations about psyche. Now, on the one side, we have the psychiatrist, and that is the person who is very interested into the whole bodily processes of the human. That's the person who works with the tangible processes that we can not only watch, but we can measure, right? On the other hand, we have the psychologist who is rather interested only in one organ pretty much of the human, that's the brain, and its effect on the rest of the body. Hence, we work here with a lot of intangible processes, a lot of very abstract processes that we can still measure, observe, and gather in very reliable ways. Because of these different points of view that these two experts have, the psychiatrist has studied medicine pretty much, the evolution of different species, biology, how different organs work, and how medicine or different substances have effect on these organs and the whole body. Whereas the psychologist, on the other side, is rather interested into the development of a single individual, more in the interactions between people and how we build personalities through these interactions, but also on our own true experiences. And as I mentioned, the crossover is pretty much the only organ we are more or less interested in. You'll find psychologists that don't know much about the brain, and that's okay. But the brain is pretty much the only tangible part that we work with. And last but not least, when it's about treatment, so when you have problems on one of these two levels and you want the good drugs, you don't go to the psychologist, you go to the psychiatrist, because this is the person who is a doctor and works with drugs, can prescribe drugs. The psychologist, or the tradition of the psychologist, which is an individual study, 3 to 5 years in Germany, to specialize as a psychotherapist, which is actual tradition coming from the psychological point of view. This person will only talk to you. And the stereotype, pretty much one of the subdisciplines of psychotherapy, the psychoanalysis, is that stereotype where you, a little bit of stereotype, where you lie on the couch and talk about your childhood. So I hope that now that it's clear that I'm talking about psychologists and maybe touching a bit upon psychotherapy, let's look at how psychologists actually view behaviors. And for that, I have a very thematically correct metaphor. You all guys know the iceberg metaphor. I assume we have a tiny tip on the surface and then a big fundament underneath that surface. So if you take the human with the face mask, of course, in the current times become normal. If we take the human and we view the human as having certain behaviors that come onto the surface, and this is only a tiny part of all the processes that actually take place underneath or in the depth of our subconsciousness. So we have the consciousness that's really on the surface, things that we realize, that's a tiny percentage actually, and a big amount of processes that take place internally that are not conscious necessarily. The first viewing or thinking about behaviors in psychology that was very dominant in psychology was, as you've probably heard, the behaviorist model. And a lot of therapies resulted from that view about behaviors. And these guys more or less concentrate on that surface, on that tangible part, the behaviors like heartbeat, me scratching my nose, all of that you can very reliably measure even. And these guys understood behaviors simply as responses to a stimuli. So there is some stimuli usually happening from the outside, which you still don't realize. Then there are some internal processes that are kind of a black box for the behaviorists. And then there is that ultimate outcome on the surface that they concentrated on. Luckily, in the middle of last century, there was something called the cognitive revolution, which changed pretty much the perception about what behaviors are. So these guys went a bit deeper and said it's not just these external behaviors, but that black box is actually quite interesting and we can access it in very reliable ways. So they understood behaviors as simply a process. So there is some input happening again from the outside or just a trigger from the inside. And then there is a mental process or different mental processes simultaneously taking place. And the behavior that the behavior is looked at, the ultimate outcome is the output. But also the mental processes, this is where the definition changed, because all the thinking, feeling, experiences, activating of memory, all that is considered behaviors. Having said that, guys, I fooled you a tiny little bit when I said at the beginning that we are going to look at a behavior theory. I'm sorry for that. It is actually, as you might imagine, a bit more integrative view at behaviors, hence we go a bit deeper, like the cognitive understanding of behaviors. And I'm going to actually introduce to you a needs theory. And I know some of your brains go here when I say needs theory. We are not going to talk about Maslow, sorry to disappoint you. Maslow's pyramid is quite an old and very much invalidated one. I want to introduce to you a much more recent theory, introduced in 2004 by Klaus Grawe, also one that is much more evidence-based, and it's a key player, or was a key finding for the whole field of psychotherapy. The whole work from Klaus Grawe, who is unfortunately not amongst us anymore, has shaped the recent movements in psychotherapy, which is called the third wave in psychotherapy, so a third revolution. His work has shaped a lot of that. So Klaus Grawe called his theory the consistency theory. And in that theory, he views behaviors pretty much as symptoms from these internal mental processes that take place. And the way he breaks that down, so everything you see underneath the surface, he says it starts with a trigger. Even if the trigger came from the outside, the internal process starts with the internal trigger. And that's one of the 4 basic psychological needs. Starting with the need for attachment, you need to feel attached to a cause or another person or a group of people. We are social beings, and that's a pretty natural psychological need we have. Then the next one being the self-esteem and enhancement, however, not meaning that last tip of Maslow's pyramid, the self-actualization, which is culturally absolutely not valid, but self-esteem and enhancement, not meaning that positive side of self, like self-love, but pretty much meaning being consistent with yourself, knowing that your good and your bad sides belong to you, finding ways, as we heard in the talk before, the therapy has a goal to find ways how you deal with your problems and you minimize the suffering from them. So that is how consistency is meant, and that is how self-esteem is meant. It's pretty much the right for yourself to be the way you are, and learning about yourself and staying more behind yourself. Then the next one that we have in the list is orientation and control. They're in no particular order, by the way. Orientation and control, however, not meaning the physical navigating streets or new places. No, it's meant in a psychological way. Imagine, guys, the situation in a schoolyard. You're the new child, and now you have to approach a clique of kids. you will first start orienting yourself in terms of who is the leader, who you talk to first, who you talk to after, maybe, if you try to win them or you walk in a conflict, as maybe Eastern Europeans will do. So in that term, psychological orientation, and then the psychological control means that you become aware or not, even on a subconscious level, you can control certain aspects of that situation, for example. So the first appearance, the first impression that you make through your appearance, through what you say first, all of that is in that bucket, the orientation and control on the psychological level. And last but not least, again, not talking about bodily pleasure or pain, but the psychological pleasure. So, and pain. So every situation that brings you satisfaction or joy or some of these positive, rather, feelings that you like to indulge in, you'll try to maximize the situation. You'll try to have more access to such situations. And then in reverse, it's kind of a scale. Of course, everything that gives you emotional discomfort or hurts you even emotionally, you try to, of course, minimize or avoid as much as possible. So the trigger starts from one of these 4 psychological basic needs, the trigger inside you. Then as next, on the next level, approaching the surface slowly, what gets more activated are motivational schemata. And these can be in 2 categories, and you can imagine them as folders or some sort of containers. And this can be in 2 categories, avoidance or approach schemata. And please don't pinpoint me on the pronunciation of schemata. Some say schemata or schemata. It's you'll find it if you Google it the way it is, and I'm sure also the proper pronunciation, I'm not good at that. So after the needs, one of these 4 basic needs has been under or overrepresented, it will kind of dominate in a certain moment. As next, it will activate, it will pull one of these hundreds, thousands of folders that you have in your brain, which will be the schemata, the container. And as next step, some of the files or sheets from that folder will be pulled out and ultimately executed as a behavior. And the sheets that are contained in the schemata are pretty much different on that fluid border between conscious and subconscious. While a goal might be something you're very aware of. If I ask you, why did you scratch your nose? And you might give me an answer. That will be your goal for your behavior. But a plan is a bit bigger, and here it gets tiny bit more abstract. You might still be aware of your bigger picture of your behavior in a bigger picture, but you might also not be that well. When we start talking about the emotional motive why you performed a certain behavior, this is where people get quite confused. So that folder that got picked up has multiple sheets in it that have more or less execution manuals for certain behaviors in certain contexts. And from these multiple sheets, a couple will be dominant, will prevail on the surface, so you might come to realize them, not necessarily, and you'll perform a behavior as a result of that. This is where we get on the tangible level. This is the consistency theory of Grawe. Consistency, again, meaning this schemata, these needs and schemata that are motivated as a result from a certain need, the behaviors that are executed on the surface are matching to each other. There are no conflict or congruences in your inner life. Now, when we want to actually analyze behavior in a very, very simplified way, we just go backwards. We start from what we see on the surface, then we look at what files were the manuals for the behavior that we saw. Then we can see which of the schemata category was picked up Was it an approach or avoidance? And that helps us see what actually triggered the whole process that we saw the final behavior or the final output as a symptom of. The actual method that I'm finally coming to talk about is called plan analysis and was developed from Klaus Grawe and a colleague of his, Caspar. And after, I think, or around the death of Grawe, Caspar actually even developed another method that was called schema analysis. But the original method that comes from these two guys and their application of that theory was called plan analysis. And I encourage you guys to look at that, but I warn you, it's a super complicated topic studying for one of the psychotherapy exams. And while helping a friend of mine doing that, I thought, you know what, it's very complicated. There are multiple books just describing every level of that theory, but that method shapes the systemic psychotherapy, which is part of that third revolution in therapy, which is a new but very broadly accepted type of theory, discipline of psychotherapy theory. And that method, I thought with that colleague of mine in 2015, we have to be able to simplify that and actually use it much more broadly, not in the clinical context, helping with problems, but rather in business or corporate context, helping with different problems. So the method that we developed and tested over half a year to see if it really works as simple as we imagined it, is pretty much, you again have that border of conscious or things that you realize, can talk about, and you have that deeper level of things that you don't realize and yet evoke a lot of processes in you. And we thought, okay, when you have that level of the tangible, of the behavior that multiple people can observe from a very factual level, as next we go on to that realized file, if you wish, the goal. What is the goal of a certain behavior? As next we dive deep level, thinking about the motive. So not necessarily the motivation, but that emotional motive, because motivation is still something you can rationalize. And then ultimately arriving at the basic needs level. So we have first that physical level, that physiological, and as I mentioned, we try to gather the behaviors on a very factual level. So for example, the person is scratching their nose. You don't say the person is nervously scratching their nose. You try to keep interpretation out of that very first level where you capture simply behaviors in their natural environment. So that's the physical level where you see the body performing something. Then you ask yourself, why did the person scratch their nose? They performed a certain behavior so that they achieve a certain goal. And pretty much if you had a self-reflected subject that you are watching and you ask them, why did you do that? They will give you that rational, functional level. There will be a certain goal behind it, certain aim for the behavior. Well, my nose was itching, for example. As next, as I mentioned, if you remember, guys, these folders can be only two categories. On a psychological level, you either approach a certain situation, you engage with it, or you try to distance yourself psychologically from it. So when you think about which one it could be, which type of category of folders, you pretty much arrive on that emotional level. And this is where it gets quite abstract, right? Because we dive under the surface. This is where the person gets irritated when you ask them, but what was your motive? And they tell you, well, it was itching. No, not your goal. What was your motive? And then they start getting irritated. And then when you arrive at that emotional level and you say, oh, okay, so you are actually trying to avoid that itching in a certain way, or trying to remove yourself or remove that stimuli. And when once you've arrived on that level and you're pretty sure you haven't gone wild in your analysis, it's pretty obvious which basic need could have triggered that process. Before I lose your brains completely, because when I do that presentation, actually that's a part of a 1.5 days workshop that I do. So when I do that live, this is the moment where my audience becomes the emoji with the question marks in their eyes. So before that happens to you guys, I promise you, in last part we are making that, or I'll try to make it a bit more tangible. You know that typical situation, you walk in a super nice hipster cafe, you hope that they have a good coffee and that they're polite in their service. However, you face that queue, and while walking past, we concentrate on that last lady. You see her watching her phone, and actually she's scrolling through Instagram, yeah? And you see her scrolling and clicking and laughing and engaging with the content she sees there. She maybe looks at the menu for a second, maybe even misses her turn. There is a gap in front of you because she's so engaged with the content. Now, the behavior that we have on that physiological level, she watches her phone and engages with her phone. If we were to ask her, dear lady, why are you doing that? She might answer something like, oh, I'm trying to see what my network is posting. I'm trying to see what my friends are posting and how they're doing, maybe. So she's trying on that functional level to stay up to date with what's happening on Instagram. However, this is where it becomes interesting. When you think in that situation where she's engaging, missing actually what she's in the coffee shop for, maybe a little bit getting distracted by her scrolling through Instagram, it's a very, very clear approach that takes place there. She's engaging with the things she's doing right now. So this is where we get to that emotional level. The staying up to date as an approach. What does it emotionally mean for her? What does it give her emotionally? It's that indirect feeling closer to others. Maybe friends, maybe even people she follows, but it's kind of that approach on an emotional level. And when we put it like that, and I remind you of the 4 basic psychological needs, it is pretty obvious that that attachment in that moment was very dominant. So she subconsciously wanted to feel closer, pulled out her phone, started engaging with the content, and we resulted watching her do that on the physiological level. However, depending on the cues that you see, let's say you walk in and you still see Instagram, but she's rather scrolling, like looks at the menu, looks at the people in front of her, and it's more you see these other cues that are more like, it's not really the same as the situation before. Now, in that case, when we ask her why she's scrolling like that, because we are trying to stay objective on that level, yeah, she might say something like, yeah, well, I'm here just to get my coffee and I'm trying to see what's happening, but it's kind of an obvious goal to breach that waiting time. And clearly, when she's trying to breach the waiting time, not actively engaging with it, it is an avoidance schemata that triggered that behavior. So whether she's trying to avoid her own impatience, getting onto her turn, or she's trying to avoid interacting with others, engaging with others, looking at other people, having the feeling to be looked at, it's avoidance, very clear emotional avoidance. And then when you put it this way, you see again, it's very obvious that only that discomfort, avoidance, or minimization can have triggered that whole process in this second context that I described. Before we kind of wrap it up, I wanted to tell you guys, as I mentioned, we developed the method or kind of simplified the method. I far not developed it, I wish, but simplified what I helped my friend learn for her exams in 2015. We tested that over half a year before I did the first workshop in 2016, and since then I've done numerous workshops working with this approach. But I found also a limit for it. And I encourage you to take it out, go out and try it. And please, please, please let me know if you find more limits. Or, of course, let me know if you found good applications for it. I would love to hear it. However, sorry, guys, to disappoint you here. It doesn't work on yourself. You can never be objective enough about yourself, and objectivity is a key criteria for doing good research. You can't be objective about yourself as much as you try. But don't get discerned, because it's a great method when you want to do very early research, when you want to understand. We talked a lot about mental models. How do people perceive the world and can see solutions in them, pain points. When we talk about feelings or experiences in similar situations, it's a great method for gathering all that deep insight that people aren't even aware of. And then we can create, based on that deep knowledge, we mentioned a couple of times, I heard in presentations before, the customer journey or a journey map, but you can also create a mental model diagram, which I use for very early research when you have nothing to compare with and very few situations to put people in to learn more from it. And once you have that big picture, as we saw before, very nicely shown, you can very well identify where your knowledge gaps are, or where the opportunities, the real deep opportunities, lie to satisfy human needs and make meaningful products and services. And then again, it's great, actually, as I said, the limit I found is analyzing yourself. I'm currently trying to analyze my cat. My whole family has went through, without them knowing, through that analysis, and I just can't switch it off. So I'm doing that all the time. You can do it with friends, with family. Warning you there, you might find very interesting things, but also with your colleagues, or as I mentioned, trying to analyze your pet, however, with some implications there, because I would argue if pets have such a dominant need for self-esteem, for the feeling to exist and to be right the way you are, which is, by the way, the definition of psychological health. And then, before I absolutely finish it and let you go, guys, and I hope you have a couple of examples of this, if it's not all clear, a couple of recommendations that are also pretty much valid for any research. So when you gather these insights or you come to analyze them, please, please, please try to always do it at least in pairs, because we very often, no matter how experienced you are, you might think you're right, but kind of slip into the wrong exit of the right way. So always try to sanity check the hypothesis you're building there. It helps. The more, the merrier. It really helps. Otherwise, you kind of end up like the self-analysis, which is like analyzing your dreams with these books that are general. Good luck. Then, because you might end up looking at just one person in just one situation, and that might end up being a complete outlier, you never ever, please, in research, base your decisions on one person or one situation. Try to watch a person in more than one situations to establish a baseline and see what is really their context of behavior, but then also try to watch similar or different people in the same situation, same context, to really learn kind of that bigger picture. And last but not least, just in case someone has thought different, we're talking about science here. So there is no 100% truth that we'll ever find out. But there is a constant hypothesis generation and testing until we get as close to the truth as possible before it has changed again and we continue again our cycles. So I hope you guys came along with me mentally and could understand the approach, and I really hope it helps you not only in your day-to-day but also in your work understanding humans on a more deeper level. Thank you.
There is one question here that Sabina's got.
Hi, Sabina.
So let's just go. So Sabina's question is, suppose I'm looking for a new solution to an existing problem. In what way can I use this knowledge to find new approaches?
Say it again. Suppose I'm looking. I guess I can see it as well.
Suppose I'm looking for a new solution to an existing problem.
Mm-hmm.
In what way can I use this knowledge to find new approaches?
Absolutely a great question. I have to say, when the problem is very, very particular, when it's really about clicking a button or something like that, very detailed, then there is very little you'll be able to find out there. But if you let people just use your stuff without talking, what we usually do in research, you're talking aloud, but you just let them use in their natural environment, then you actually get things that people are not self-aware about and hence not able to actually talk about, right? So that deeper knowledge really helps to see opportunities from a different perspective rather than that very functional level of features, for example. Hope that answers the question.
Fantastic. Okay. Martina, that's it. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for staying with us.
Thank you, guys. And I'm looking forward to the next sessions. Great sessions.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm
so
celebrating here all the time. It's great.